Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, digging books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan Herenstein, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, everybody.
And this time, we are doing something a little different. As we mentioned in the last podcast, I will be away for enough this month that we decided to not start up our new book just yet. Instead, we're going to be talking about the kids' book, Dave the Potter, Artist, Poet, Slave, by Laban Carrick-Hill. And if you're not interested in the book itself, that's fine, because actually what we're mostly interested in talking about today is the subject of the book, Dave the Potter, or his full name, David Drake. But before we do that, as always, a little housekeeping. If you are listening to this as a podcast, please be sure to give us a review. We really appreciate that kind of feedback. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please like, subscribe, and leave us a comment. All of that helps the algorithm. And once again, we really appreciate hearing from you all and hearing what you think. Also, I want to reiterate that next time we will be starting a new book, kind of in our usual pattern. This book is titled The Lost City of the Monkey God, A True Story by Douglas Preston. And so if you recall, a while ago, we had a poll with books for people to vote on, and this was one of them, and this one came in second, but we liked it enough, we decided we're going to go ahead and read it.
And I feel it was pretty close.
There was enough support for this that I think it's fully, well, we can do what we want. It's our podcast. But it's also, enough people seemed interested in it that we think it was a good option. So yeah. You can find this online in usual places in multiple different formats. This, unlike our previous book, is a much cheaper and more accessible financially book if you want to read along. It was also written in 2017, so there may be some copies in libraries or such as well if you wanted to try that avenue. So first, going on with Dave the Potter, Artist, Poet, Slave. I thought we'd talk a little bit about this book and how we use it.
Yes.
So we mostly use this book within a series of programs we have called Archaeology Storytime, which is a program that is designed to introduce archaeological concepts to children as young as kindergarten, which is kind of a big deal because before our coworker put this kind of system together, we thought these kind of complicated abstract concepts were too much for that age group.
Right.
So he has actually found it as a good way of actually getting groups to engage with and actually understand these concepts. So the book itself is very simple, which is what we want, of course. As far as the context, I will say the illustrations are phenomenal.
Yeah,
in particular.
The illustrations, and when I read this book to children, I always get like oohs and ahs over the illustrations, and kids always stop me so that they can look at the pictures closer.
The illustrations are by Brian Collier, just to give them credit there. And so content-wise, I think it's a very nice, gentle book. Very sweet. It does touch on concepts of slavery.
Yeah.
But it isn't too deep into that. So I think if you have a young one whom you want to at least broach a little bit of this subject, this would be a good book for that, because it's not about slavery. And if that's something that you want, if you want a gentle approach to that, I guess I would say.
Yeah, it's not about slavery, but that is part of the context in which this person existed.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's part of getting to know Dave.
Yeah.
So yeah, some good descriptions of the process of making pottery. So there's some good practical stuff. And then it ends with Dave writing a poem into the side of his pot, which is one of the reasons that this individual is so well known.
Yep.
Because he is one of and we have talked before about how unrepresented certain groups of people are in history because of things weren't written down. And he is one of the rare cases we have where someone was able to write at least a little bit down.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the reasons this is so standout. Also, it's important to remember that at the time he was alive, so he was, born around 1800 and died in the 1870s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
At the time he was writing these, it was very illegal and pretty dangerous to be literate as an enslaved man.
Right. And I think, honestly, that's one of the reasons, his pots are in actual existence right now. And that's one of the reasons that those pots are so collectible.
As far as how David actually learned to write, I don't know that we have a clear answer. I've seen a few ideas floated for how that could have happened, but no one really seems to know for sure.
Yeah, I know it was, I wouldn't say common, but oftentimes if someone who was enslaved did learn to read, it was biblical teachings, because especially, I guess, some thought it was okay for them to be able to read the Bible, but others had issue with it for various reasons that are quite varied, I guess. But one thing I came across was that they believe he was self-taught by reading the Bible. First of all, I can't imagine like trying to teach yourself in that day and age. I don't know how that would even be possible. I feel like somebody would have to kind of at least start you off.
Right.
But, it was illegal to teach someone who was enslaved to read or write.
Mm-hmm.
So it wouldn't be documented. Do you have any other?
I saw two hypotheses. Like I said, they didn't have real strong arguments other than this is a possibility. One is that one of the enslavers, I think Drake, actually owned a newspaper. And so the hypothesis that maybe that David worked there for a while and maybe picked it up there. Another one is that the second enslaver, Landrum, was very religious. And so that he may have learned to read the Bible in that scenario.
Okay, which I can see either one of those.
I could see there's a whole bunch of possibilities, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know that we'll ever know, but the key takeaway there is that this was very not legal at the time.
Yeah.
Very dangerous for him to have this knowledge and for people to do it, but more for him to have the knowledge, frankly.
Right. And that's why his ceramics are so collectible today and why they're so sought after. They're in private collections. They're also in museum exhibits, but I don't know that we would, other ceramics like that, maybe not that large. He was known for making very large vessels, but other stoneware from that time period exist that aren't as sought after, I guess is the right word.
Well, not that it's still about the thing, but we always talk about how it's about the story and how much the story actually lends meaning to the thing.
Right.
And that's a reason because we have context for the man who made it, at least a little bit, whereas the other ones, we don't necessarily have any personal context to them, especially if they're taken out of that context.
Yes. Right? And I know some of the ones that are in museum exhibits do provide a lot of context, about what little is known about David Drake. Probably less so in private collections. Right. This is usually the case, but I'm glad there are some that are in, more public museum type collections. And they're very well documented online as well.
So he had a series of enslavers, and he was making pottery for most of these. For one of them, he goes silent. There are no inscriptions from him, at least that we have. And the hypothesis is that this enslaver was particularly abusive. So I think I've heard another one that perhaps it was an especially dangerous time for Dave to actually be writing on the pots. Not that those are necessarily mutually exclusive either.
Right, yeah, that's true.
At some point, Dave had a leg amputated. We don't know why. I have heard there is some conjecture why, but it seems pretty sparse as to why. Unless you ran across something that was a little more substantial.
No,
Barbara.
I didn't. And part of me was surprised by that, but I guess taken into the context of the times, considering he was an enslaved man, I guess it doesn't surprise me, but as well known as he is now, I'm surprised. I guess there wouldn't be any historic documentation or anything,
right?
But I want to know, I guess.
One of the other reasons that Dave is especially notable is that he was one of the few people in the U.S. at the time that was able to make especially large pots.
Yes, like they were huge, some of them. Can I provide a little context about the factories?
Of course, go ahead.
So he worked on plantations and in factories in Edgefield, South Carolina, which is now famous for its ceramics, specifically stoneware, which is kind of a utilitarian type ceramic used for storage. It wasn't something that you would put on your fine dinner table to eat off of. It was kitchenware, essentially. Edgefield became kind of a area in which a lot of these stoneware ceramics were made, and this became necessary. It's an alkaline glazed stoneware, and they call it now like the Edgefield district, and they're still famous for ceramics in that area, specifically stoneware. But the plantations had a need for larger storage vessels, and a lot of the articles I was reading say it was to store food for the enslaved, but I think it was also probably, I would assume, to store the products that they were growing to, for the people the enslavers as well. But there was an increase in demand, which spurred local manufacturing techniques because before that, the European wares that were coming in for these plantations were struggling to keep up with demand. So they kind of formed their own kind of ceramic making district. So, and a lot of the people, well, all of the people that worked in these ceramic making factories were enslaved, including Dave.
And it's thought that in his lifetime, he may have made as many as 40,000 pieces. Currently, we have 20 with poetry on them. 50 more have his signature in some form. And the largest one we know of is 40 gallons. So that's 29 inches tall and 85 inches in circumference, just to kind of give you an idea of how big some of these were.
I can't imagine, because I believe they were making them on wheels too. They called them turners. That was like their official occupation title. And I've taken ceramics classes. I don't know how you would do that.
Right.
Like, that is an amazing talent that I just cannot wrap my mind around. I made tiny little pots and they were just falling in on themselves. Oh, I'm impressed. I mean, it's amazing to me. And then to fire them too. Like, you have to be able to
explode.
Yeah. Like, wow. Oh, another thing I wanted to point out, and I would have to look more into this. Edgefield pots or ceramics, there is possible evidence that before enslaved were making them in these large factories, that they were being made by Native Americans, and specifically the Catawba Nation. But I would have to look into it more, because apparently...
This actually feels like the conversation we had in Small Things Forgotten.
Yes.
About how there was the original thought that colonial ware was made by Native Americans, and he made a very good case for no, it was not.
Right. So I would have to look more into it, but it is kind of an interesting side quest.
Yeah. And actually, if you want to look more into kind of how this system developed, this type of ceramic industry, basically, give these Small Things Forgotten books a listen, because that does take a much deeper dive into kind of what leads up to this point.
And I think I'm wondering if the issue is like more that Native Americans made ceramics in the same region,
right?
And they may have used the same type of clay because they were in the same region. So is it really the same ceramic? Is it not? Because they weren't making them in factories, and Native Americans didn't necessarily glaze their ware. So I just have a lot of questions, but I think it's interesting. And it did make me think it's amazing how all of our books kind of intertwine, isn't it?
Yeah, I thought that would start to happen.
Yeah. So I would have to look more into it, but I thought it was interesting, and I wanted to point it out because it did relate to a previous book we had read.
Yeah.
So check out those episodes as well.
So to kind of complement our episode today, I tried to look into some research papers on this, and I wasn't having a lot of luck. I don't know if you found anything, Barbara, but mostly what I was seeing was a lot of debate around the X marks he would use on his pots.
Yeah.
Some people seem to think it was simply in place of a signature. Others argue, well, he could write, so he wouldn't have used that. A lot of people seem to think that this X mark is actually related to some African traditions, and he was actually doing this, may have been communicating with the people he knew was receiving them, at least in some kind of indirect way.
Yeah, and I saw something too about that mark, and I guess, there were some other potential marks. Some people say it may have been some type of way that he kept inventory. I would need more information because they're all the same.
Feels like a lot of possibilities.
Yeah.
And it's a little hard to really pin down what exactly.
Right.
The mark that they're referencing that came from Africa, they know is actually in African culture, is actually a X mark with a circle connecting it. But these aren't always that, I guess. Sometimes they are, I think. Sometimes they are not.
And if it was, as some believe might have been like an act of like resistance, then maybe,
which the poetry itself was,
right? Yeah. And maybe he didn't want it to resemble specifically like an African tradition. He thought an X, he knew what it meant, but he made it different enough that it wouldn't get somebody in trouble, or I don't know.
Right.
A lot of speculation, and we may never know.
So actually, we should probably talk about a few of his pieces of poetry, at least a little bit.
Yes.
Did you have any favorites that stood out to you, Barbara?
I mean, no, not any specifics. I know there was one that was signed by Mark and Dave, and they wonder if Mark may have been his son, but it didn't have a poem on it.
Isn't there someone who may have been helping him turn the wheel when he lost his leg?
Yes. And some have wondered if Mark was that too.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or if it was his son helping him. I saw that as like a potential.
And sometimes the enslaver's name is on there for probably practical reasons.
Yeah, and I know Drake, his last name, you know, he became known as David Drake. Drake was the name of like his
slaver.
Yeah.
Which, based on census records, is apparently the name he chose once he was freed.
Right.
So a couple of the more famous poems, the ones that you'll see very quickly if you look this up, put every bit all between, surely this jar will hold 14, which is a kind of a cute description of what the jar will do. It was a 14-gallon, I think, jar.
Yeah.
Probably the most poignant that I'm aware of. I wonder where is all my relation, friendship to all and every nation.
That's the one I was going to pick out is my favorite. Is it's I think it's telling of the times and of him personally. Like he must have been pondering, because I know at one point he had a wife and she was sold. Yeah. So
and a child, I think, too.
And a child. Yeah. So, I mean, that's hard to fathom, and it happens so often. I think it's very telling of the times that he chose to put that into a poem that in essence is an act of resistance, right? So somebody reading that, what would they have thought, especially if they were an enslaver, you know, or something? Like, wow, it's powerful to me. And the fact that he then offers friendship to all and every nation.
There's a positivity implied, right? Some of them have a nice bit of sense of humor. I like this one. When you fill this jar with pork or beef, Scott will be there to get a piece.
Yeah.
I like that.
I have a feeling Scott liked to get the munchies.
Yep. It seems like, yeah. So anyway, I'd encourage you to look them up. If you're, of course, watching this in video format, I will have some images to accompany this so you can see some of that yourself. But if you Google Dave the Potter or David Drake, you will very quickly come up with some of this information, and it's worthwhile. He was a remarkable individual, and we don't know as much as we would like to about him. But there is actually a few books which I've added one to the list in particular. I thought this was a little interesting. It's called Carolina Clay, The Life and Legend of Slave Potter Dave. And this book is apparently written by a man who is a artist potter by trade, and got interested in Dave the Potter, and then started researching him, and then eventually discovered that one of his ancestors was one of the Dave's enslavers.
Oh,
and
wow.
So I don't know, from that premise could raise some alarm bells, but I saw some reviews about this in journals that seem to imply very positive things about the book as a whole. Considering how little information is readily available, I wonder a little bit how you would make a whole book out of this. But they also said that this author was very good about being clear when he was kind of guessing or saying what he thinks happened versus what actual evidence says. So we might add that to the list and try that out someday. Or if there's another book that folks think we should check out instead, or in addition to that, let us know and we can get that added too. All right, so that's all we're actually going to cover for this one. Like we said, this is going to be a shorter one, but we'll be back to normal next time with The Lost City of the Monkey God, a true story by Douglas Preston. So join us next time. We're going to dive into that, and we're really looking forward to that one. So be sure to tune in.
Yeah, and if you have kiddos, remember Dave the Potter is a great book for them, and we would highly recommend it.
Highly recommend, yes. So we'll see you all next time.
Happy reading, everybody.
Archaeology Books for Fun is brought to you by the Florida Public Archaeology Network, a program of the University of West Florida. You can find out more about archaeology and about FPAN at fpan.us. We appreciate any feedback, so if you're listening to us as a podcast, please leave us a review, and if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening.